I grew up in a secular Jewish home, and I often joke the way we did our religious holidays was like, they tried to kill us, they failed, let's eat. Okay, that was the essence of my religious upbringing. And I had been raised in a very secular home, as that obviously, and I was raised very postmodern. You have your truth, you have your truth, and there's no truth above, which no God's eye view, truth is just personal, social, relative, whatever. And that's how I was raised, that's how I believed. And then one day, and I'm not going to go into all the details, but it hit me that truth had to exist. It hit me that there's a world, there's a universe here, there's something here, something had to explain it. And whatever that something was, that was the truth with a capital T. And so I still remember when that thought hit me. This was in the early to mid 1970s. I remember walking down a street, and I remember thinking to myself, if it were humanly possible to know this truth, because even though I knew it had to exist, we're here, something's here, something had to explain it, and that was the truth. Even though I knew it had to exist, I realized I might not ever be able to know it. Okay, maybe I could, maybe I couldn't. But I remember thinking to myself, I was maybe 21 years old. And I remember thinking, if it were humanly possible, because again, as I said, I know this truth had to exist, but I might not ever be able to know it. But I remember thinking, if it were humanly possible to know this truth, I didn't care what it was, where it led me, what it cost me, what I had to suffer. I thought, if I could know it, I wanted to know it no matter what. And well, all I know is of all the different paths I could have gone on, I got into all sorts of silliness at one point or another. But all I know of all the different paths I could have gone on, the different ways I could have gone on, I ended up as a Seventh-day Adventist, which was kind of remarkable because in my life there were two kinds of people I really did not like. I did not like Christians, and I did not like vegetarians. But anyway, I wound up as a Seventh-day Adventist. And it was a long process, and I'm not going to be able to get into all the details, but I will say this. At one point, I said, God, if you exist, I need a sign. I've only found out later that Scripture says Greek seeks for wisdom, Jews seek for a sign. And at one point I said, God, if you exist, I need a sign. You got to show me that you exist. Well, right after that happened, and again, this is I'm skipping over a lot. I met a guy who had my same name, Cliff Goldstein. I was from Miami Beach. Turned out he was from Miami Beach. He was living on the same kibbutz in Israel that I had lived in months earlier. Not only was in the same kibbutz, he was in the same room that I had lived in, and I had left that room months earlier. Not only in the same room, but he was in the same bed that I had been in. And now that's getting kind of weird. And then I remember I looked up on the bookshelf over his bed, and I saw that a bunch of books on the bookshelf that I had left when I was living in that room. And I saw the books, and I said, Cliff, you like my books? And he says, what are you talking about? Those are all my books. And I looked up at the same books that I had had on the bookshelf when I was living in that room he had. And for some reason, I looked at the guy and said, Cliff, are you a writer? And he says, yeah, I want to be a writer. Well, I was living in Israel on the kibbutz writing. And then, to top it off, we're talking, and this girl walks into the room. I never saw her before. It's his girlfriend. She's blonde. She's from Denmark. Her name is Tina. When I lived on the kibbutz, I had a blonde Danish girlfriend named Tina. Okay, now, again, I know this is kind of bizarre, but somebody had said to me at one point, they said, Cliff, you were asking God for signs. He said, what more do you want? The Lord's calling you by name. Well, anyway, this was kind of heavy. Meeting a guy with the same name from the same city in the same room, the same bed, same books, wanted to do the same thing. So it definitely got my attention, but I wasn't born again yet or anything like that. I didn't know God. I knew there was something else out there. Well, right about this time too, at this stage of my life, I had one goal in my life, one goal alone. I had been writing, and I had been working on I wanted to be a novelist or nothing. And I had been working on this novel for 2.5 years. And I was back in Gainesville, Florida, writing my novel. Nothing else mattered to me other than writing this book. It was my life. Totally, everything in my life was dedicated to writing this book. Nothing else mattered. Well, I come back to Gainesville, Florida, and I'm working on my novel. And right about the same time, I start having these occult experiences. I start having this sensation that I'm leaving my body and floating outside my body and so forth. And even though I know there's no such thing as a separate conscious immortal soul, I know that now. But back then I didn't know that. And I remember thinking, wow, maybe the occult, maybe spiritualism, maybe this is the truth that I'm looking for. And so I decide I'm going to study the occult. I'm going to study spiritualism. So the next day I'm walking to the library to get a book on the occult. And I was really the epitome of a hungry writer. And I needed a job. And there was a health food store. And so I knock on the door of the health food store. I mean, I'm even going to work for hated vegetarians. I mean, that's how desperate I was. And this guy comes out, and we start talking, and I think he's an atheist or something. And I say something about faith and the occult. He goes, what? And he pulls me in the health food store, and he locks the door. And then I start telling him about my occult experiences. And he starts to warn me about this. And he starts talking to me about the devil. Well, come on. Talking to me back then about the devil. I mean, he might as well told me that Santa was going to come down the chimney and not bring presents if I wasn't a good boy. Okay? So anyway, he says, here. He obviously saw he wasn't going to convince me, but he says, read this book. And he hands me a book. And I pick up the book. I'd never seen the book before, never heard of the author, but I'm a writer, so I'm a reader. So I take the book, put it under my arm, and I walk over to the library to get a book on the occult. And I wasn't in school then, so I couldn't check the occult book out. But I go, and for the first time in my life, I get an occult book. And I sit down in the library. And I start reading the occult book. And I read the first chapter of the occult book. And I even practice the first technique. I sit there practicing the first technique. And I thought, okay, I'm going to come back. I'm going to get into this occult stuff. Well, I couldn't check the book out because I wasn't enrolled in school. So I go to put the book back on the shelf. Now, the bottom line is I'm walking through the library And for the first time in my life, I've got a book on the occult. First time to get into it. And literally, in one hand, I've got that book. And literally, in my other hand, I've got the book the guy handed me in the health food store. Okay, one book in one hand, cult book in one hand, and what do you think the book was in my hand that the guy handed me? A cult book in one hand, the great controversy in the other. Okay, now, I was totally clueless as to what was going on. I mean, I had no idea what was in this book. I mean, it was all coming down to the wire for me. First time in the occult, and I've got the great controversy in my hand, which I read the beginning of it. I didn't even really get to the occult stuff until later, and then I understood better what was happening to me. But anyway, the bottom line is, I've got great controversy at my home, and I'm starting to read it. And it's the fall of 1979. I'm 23 years old. I had put 2.5 years of my life into this novel I was writing. Nothing mattered other than this novel. If you ask me, did I believe in God at this point, and whatever, between meeting my double, which I knew something had to arrange that, and between these occult experiences, I knew there was more to reality than what I was taught in high school physics or whatever. There was definitely a deeper reality. But outside of that, God, Jesus, none of it meant anything to me. All that mattered was my book. Well, I walk home to my room. As I said, it was 1979, I was 23 years old. And I walk into my room to work on my novel. I had a manual typewriter back then. And right before I work, I don't know why I did this, but I just closed my eyes. And I didn't even know who it was, who I was even praying to. But I just closed my eyes and utter a prayer. And somehow, in the back and forth, in the great controversy, all God needed was that opening, that prayer. And then at that instant, when I said that prayer, immediately the presence of the Lord Jesus Christ came to me in the room. I knew exactly who he was, and I knew exactly what he wanted. And his exact words were to me, Cliff, you have been playing with me enough. You have been praying with me long enough. If you want me tonight, burn your novel. In other words, he showed me at that instant that novel was my God. You shall have no other gods before me. And that if I wanted the Lord, that novel had to go. I mean, it was just as clear cut before me as it could possibly be. Everything was right here. That was my God. I had to burn it. And at one point I said, okay, God, if you exist, I said, okay, God, let me just finish the novel. And then I'll give my heart to you. If you want me tonight, burn the novel. I said, all right, God, look, I'll write it all to your glory. No, if you want me tonight, burn the novel. And I said, please, can't I just put this thing away and we deal with it another time? If you want me, burn the novel. And the bottom line was I jumped up out of the room. I could have slit my throat easier than burn the novel. I had nothing else in the world. And I walked through the streets, and these were the same streets of Gainesville when I remember thinking I wanted to know truth no matter the cost. Now I understood, that night I understood what the cost was. And the bottom line, at one point, not knowing anything what I was getting into, I finally stopped and I said, okay, God, I want you and I want truth more than I want this novel. And at that moment, just the moment I made that decision, everything lifted off me. I went back to my room, knowing nothing about the Bible, knowing nothing about salvation, knowing nothing about Adventists, knowing nothing about the great controversy, knowing nothing. I burned that novel. And that was the night I became a born-again believer in Jesus. And funny too, the moment I gave my heart to Jesus that night, those occult experiences never came back. And eventually I studied with the Adventists in the health food store, read The Great Controversy, and well, that was almost over 40 years ago, and here I am today. You know, the book Great Controversy, I think one of the amazing things about Great Controversy is you got to remember the time she wrote it. She wrote it at a time of virulent anti-Catholicism in America. And the views and for her at that day and age, to make the prediction that Catholics and Protestants would unite, to make that prediction back then just seemed absurd. It seemed absurd. And yet, if I remember in the 1990s, reading, these Catholics and Protestants were signing documents about common views on justification, and they were united. And I remember I talked to a Jesuit priest one time, and he said something. I said, what about with Luther? He said, it's over. It's over. The rift is, all this stuff. If you look at the stuff today, it's amazing for Ellen White to have written that in her day and age, to see what we see happening today. It really is powerful. And that, I think, is one of the very powerful elements of the Great Controversy. So, there's no question getting the Great Controversy in the right hands of the right people at the right time could be a great blessing to people. Ideally, you have some people who have been studying, they have a bit of a background, and then you say, hey, would you like to get into this deeper? That would be an ideal situation, I think, to share the Great Controversy with. Of course, you never know. Somebody could pick it up blind off the street, find it in their mailbox, pick it up, read it. Wow. It can, the book was inspired by God. And it was a book that Ellen White wanted to see out there. So I think we really do need to get the Great Controversy into as many hands as possible, ideally getting into the hands of people who are really ready for it. But sometimes we don't know. So let's get it out there, and let's let the Lord do his work through the book written by his messenger.